Welcome to this sessional research event, Improving the Success of InsurTech Opportunities, presented by members of the Working Party for Risk Management in a Digital World. My name's Alan Ray. I'm a member of the IFOA Council, and I'm chairing this session on behalf of Scottish Board. For those of you who are worried, our beloved leader of the Scottish Board, Alan Watson, is alive and well and is just taking a break this evening. So just introducing tonight's topic, I think I probably won't introduce it very much. I'm not, perhaps at my age, the best person to introduce an InsurTech talk. Maybe I can ask the sort of man on the cloth of omnibus questions if none of you have some more relevant questions. But as I understand it, the Working Party was set up, and they're been looking from an insurance company's perspective, and with the insurance companies having all these ERM systems and skills, and looking at how that might apply to investing in InsurTech projects in startups, which are quite different animals. So the speakers tonight from the Working Party are Darko Popovic, on my immediate left, who is a senior manager at Crow Global Risk Consulting, where he specializes in assisting companies with risk and capital management. He has a diverse background, including roles at a startup micro-insurer and consultancy and in-house experience for firms across Europe, North America, and South Africa. His co-presenter tonight is Richard Purcell, who leads the Insurance Innovation Services team within the Life and Financial Services practice at Hymans Robertson. He's had various roles in risk management and actuarial reporting, and he's also a member of the Health and Care Practice Board for the IFOA. So I understand that Darko will begin and then hand over to Richard. You're going first? Yeah. Oh, sorry, Richard will begin and then hand over to Darko. Sorry, yes. I got it wrong.
Good evening. So I'm going to start by just introducing the Working Party and a bit of background to why we started. So about a year ago, we formed, just taking these facts into account, I suppose, knowing that there was an awful lot of development into enterprise risk management frameworks with insurers over the past few years. We'd also seen increased focus and investment into new digital solutions, and including InsurTech as an area. But it wasn't clear whether these risk management capabilities were being utilized fully, or whether there were any development needs in these new areas. So that was the background. So we formed, as I say, a year ago, 9 of us, a mix of people working in life and GI, and working in insurers and working in consulting. So we focused on InsurTech because it's an area where there's been an awful lot of activity. It's a big buzzword. Some people might say, well, what is InsurTech even? And I suppose it could mean anything that involves insurance and technology. But some of the examples that tend to come to mind often focus around improving the customer experience and journey. So you might have new apps, you might be using fitness devices, you might be making more effective comparison sites. Those are the examples that come to mind. And they all seem to have a general theme around making that customer journey better, with a view to widening access to the insurance market and growing the market. And that's where I suppose we thought there was an interesting point to note is there is an awful lot of opportunity. And I've picked these two stats, I suppose, to show the true scale to help grow, in particular, the life and health insurance market, because we've got a big protection gap in the UK. So Swiss Re estimate that there's a £2.4 trillion protection gap. That's the difference between the amount of cover they estimate people do need in the way of life and critical illness, etc., versus the cover they do have through individual and group protection. So a huge opportunity to grow the market, and turning that into the customer's perspective, about 1 in 10 people have their income protected. So InsurTech, I suppose, can be viewed as a great way to help grow the market and help fill this gap. So lots of exciting opportunities, and it's an area that's attracting an awful lot of investment. So these are some stats global figures around the level of funding raised for InsurTech, as it's been deemed, opportunities, fundraising, and as you can see, an increasing trend upwards in 2017, over $2 billion worth of funding, and that's in life and GI. And I think it's fair to say in the past, a lot of the activity has been in GI, but there's been more focus recently in the life and health space. So that's a bit of background to InsurTech and what's going on broadly. So as a working party then, we thought, okay, we want to really understand the current approach of insurers in this space, what are people's understandings and knowledge, and we wanted also to do that through a survey to understand what's going on, and also to conduct some interviews to have a deeper level of knowledge. So I'm going to share with you some highlights of the survey, and Darko will then later produce some highlights of the interviews. And the working party also wanted to produce something practical as well. So a number of tools have been created along with the report, which again Darko will give a quick summary of after. So I'm just going to touch on some of the results of the survey. So we carried out the survey about a year ago now. As I say, we wanted to capture the views of people working in this space, so they could be working for startups or for insurers. And we also wanted to see what insurers were doing, what their approach was. And we wanted to cast the net wide, so we wanted to publicise it to members of the profession, but also people outside. So we use all the usual channels, emails and conferences, etc. So we had in total 124 responses, and about 10% of those were non-members of the IFOA. So just a bit more on who answered our survey. Most people were working for insurance companies, with then the rest working for investors or startups or consulting firms. About a third working for life sector, a third working for GI, and then the rest working in finance, investment, or ERM. And then in terms of the roles and responsibilities of people, about a quarter or a third are working in product pricing and strategy, while the rest are working in capital, reserving, and risk management. So a mix of people kind of thinking about risks from a sort of second line versus first line perspective. So we wanted to first start by asking what value InsurTech could add to the whole sector, and then also firms in particular. So generally quite positive feedback. The majority of people thought it had broad ramifications for the whole industry, with only a small number thinking it's a very niche area that's just for tech experts to worry about. And in terms of the value it can deliver for insurers, again, the vast majority thought it was either a moderate or vital role in helping to deliver on insurers' business strategy. Only a relatively small number thought it would play a limited or no role. So yeah, quite a positive sentiment. And perhaps that's to be expected. Perhaps people are self-selecting to take part in our survey on InsurTech, but quite positive nonetheless. We also asked them what are the drivers for the activity that we're seeing, the adoption of InsurTech. So I think it's fair to say most of the responses were, or the sentiment was, it's happening to the insurance industry rather than the insurance industry driving it. So if you look at these, about a third are as a result of technology or new technologies just emerging, or them being used in other industries and therefore just feeding through into the insurance industry. Another third is from customer needs and expectations changing, and then quite another chunk also just from startups emerging and operating in the insurance space. Only about a quarter are actually as a result of insurers investing in new technologies, or perhaps driving down expenses being a key focus for some insurers. So it's something that's happening to the industry, so therefore suggests that insurers are reacting rather than proactively pushing on some of these initiatives. So what are insurers doing? We asked them whether or not their organisations are currently engaging in InsurTech in some way. Again, most people seem to be, so over a quarter are fully engaged in investing or developing new opportunities. Some are active, some are just observing the market, and then less than a quarter doing nothing at all. So most seem to be doing something in this space. And in terms of how they're going about it, 20% are focusing on working with or buying startups in order to acquire the expertise and capability. About a quarter are developing their ideas internally. But the most common approach was a combined approach, if you like, so doing a bit of both, developing their own ideas and looking externally for input as well. We also wanted to understand people's knowledge of new technologies. So we asked them if they were aware of a list of many technologies, things like blockchain, machine learning, big data, things we've all heard. As expected, most people have heard of them, so all the red bars there in the 90s response rate. But then we asked them, are you comfortable explaining it to a colleague? And that's where we saw an interesting gap emerge. People were much less comfortable, and so the responses there were sort of between 60 and 70%, with blockchain being a bit more of an outlier. People were particularly uncomfortable explaining how that works and what the applications are, which is fair enough, it is a bit more complex. So that was an interesting takeaway for us. People are aware, but then they don't feel comfortable explaining. I don't think perhaps they really understand some of these technologies. That's a bit of a challenge for insurers if they're meant to be considering how these technologies might be used in their business, what risks they pose if they don't really understand how they work. So we did ask them also what they thought the key risks were. The biggest was lack of understanding of concepts and technologies. That was reassuring that people were at least recognizing there was this bit of knowledge gap there around new technologies. Also concern around the timing risk. If you do invest in or adopt new technologies, that you get it wrong in terms of when you roll it out. Are you going to be too soon or too late? And the expense involved in whole new technologies. And reputational risk not far behind. And then after that, cyber risk, data privacy, conduct risk, all the things that we're perhaps a bit more used to seeing further down the list. So we asked them, are existing ERM frameworks then suitable? And a bit of a mixed response really in terms of whether or not they thought their own company's existing risk management frameworks were suitable for assessing and managing all these risks associated with new technologies. So, 50-50 split there. And we then asked them if they thought they had the right skills to assess some of these technologies. And about 20% thought that they did have the necessary skills without requiring further training. The majority of people thought they would benefit from some further training. And over a quarter thought that they would look to external help, that they weren't the best people effectively to look at these new technologies and assess the risks. So some food for thought there, I suppose, in terms of perhaps we need to develop our frameworks, perhaps we need to improve our understanding of some of these technologies. And overall, there seems to be a lot of positive sentiment around InsurTech, lots of potential. There's a variety of stages and approaches being adopted by insurers, but there is this significant skills gap, as it were, and the need perhaps to develop the risk management frameworks. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Darko, who's going to explain some of the results of the interviews that we conducted.
Thanks, Richard. Good evening, everyone. So, as Richard said, we carried out a survey, which had some really interesting findings in it, but we thought, wouldn't it be nice if we enriched this information a little bit by speaking to actual people in industry on a one-to-one basis. I won't, conscious it's a sessional event, so I should point out it's not necessarily statistically significant, what I'm about to tell you. We only spoke to about 10 people or so, but there were CEOs, a couple of chief risk officers, one or two people who are owners of InsurTech companies as well. And really what we wanted to do is to understand what the sentiment is within the industry, within senior stakeholders, in terms of investing in InsurTech, the approach to risk management, and just some of the emerging sort of trends that they're seeing. And have a look at whether that ties up to what our survey is saying and so forth. So the sort of questions we asked them predominantly focused on trends, opportunities, and risks. And also, for those that had direct experience, a few questions around any lessons learned and recommendations and so forth. In terms of the key themes or the key points arising, I think when we look at the growth of InsurTech and the drivers of this growth, pricing and the customer experience were cited as the two main things. So this is really the pressure on companies to stay ahead of the curve in terms of both pricing sophistication, but also customer experience and whether traditional insurers are really providing the service to customers that the customers desire. Looking at ERM frameworks, I know the survey pointed out that some felt they're appropriate and some felt otherwise. Our interviewees broadly thought that existing ERM frameworks remain relevant. However, there are so-called unknown unknowns to deal with, and really the challenge is that insurers sometimes find themselves having to launch products or services or ventures without fully understanding the risk, and it's this balance between speed and flexibility in the decision-making and in the process versus managing risks in an appropriate way. So it leads to this point of not wanting to stifle innovation. When it came to key emerging risks, our interviewees predominantly focused on conduct and regulatory risks. And I think the good example that was given was around, when do you actually start falling foul of the regulator in terms of conduct, and when does a comparison website, for example, become an advisor, and so forth. Another thing that was mentioned very much was model risk, and really the kind of danger of it becoming a black box if you get sort of too clever without the appropriate controls and so forth. In terms of managing threats to business models, I suppose really this can be summarized as this balance between keeping pace, so that, balancing the fear of losing out by not doing something versus having to actually make a informed, careful decision. So that is some perspective on that. I call these mini case studies, but really they're just short examples of 4 topics that more than one person touched upon. So first one, customer facing versus back office. So the general perception, I think, is that certainly a lot of the hype, and if you do attend any InsurTech events, a lot of the hype, a lot of the pitches tend to be on the customer facing side, customer acquisition and customer experience. Most of our executives, interestingly, felt that actually it's the back office that is ripe for some innovation. So it's an interesting one to think about for those who are involved in this area. Insurers versus startups. So if I use a really broad brush approach, insurers have the capital and the customers, most of them anyway, and the startups have the ideas and the infrastructure. So there was a lot of, I suppose, agreement between our executives that really a collaborative approach is the way forward. And I think our survey to a large extent showed that as well. I think we had about 50% of all respondents saying that the insurance companies are working together with an InsurTech firm rather than doing something solely in-house or rather than solely acquiring an InsurTech and not doing anything with them. So a lot of emphasis on the collaborative approach. Then moving on, a number of people touched, financial services and other sectors, in fact, but I've just sort of focused on the financial services sector. A lot of sentiment that banking is further ahead than insurance on a lot of these aspects. So I think the implication for us as insurance practitioners is, to have a look at what banks are doing and try and understand how much of that we can leverage in the insurance sector as well. Again, I should say a lot of the banking sort of success stories are on the customer-facing side as well. And then finally, an interesting one is this whole issue of risk and the upside and the downside. So focusing on the downside, certainly there was a lot of discussion around the fact that insurers by their very nature, are quite uncomfortable with the idea of failing. And certainly, when it comes to these sort of ventures, quite a number will fail before one does succeed. So, on the one hand, there was a number of thoughts and questions around how do we deal with the fact that there's a much larger propensity to fail here, and that's okay. On the other hand, a number of people who had a positive experience were very keen to point out that there is a risk on the upside as well, in that a lot of these success stories really do happen overnight. And a number of people were sort of quite anecdotal about situations where a particular app or product went from a proof of concept stage to full market penetration virtually overnight. And it doesn't take too much imagination to think that if, for example, you're providing a service to some kind of insurance service to, say, I'm making this up, but let's say online retail companies, if you were to get Amazon and eBay as your two clients in a space of 3 months, that's effectively virtually full market saturation. So a number of people are very keen to point out that success happens a lot quicker as well, and there are many, many risks in that, from that perspective as well. And in fact, someone pointed out that someone who did have one of these 3-month success stories pointed out that the standard notice period for CROs is 3 months. And so, it just gives you some context on how quickly companies have to move if things do work out. So, again, conscious sessional events, so trying not to bring too much anecdotes and gossip in, but I couldn't resist one slide of interesting quotes, so planning to read through these. So someone said, the industry is mainly focused on financial risks, much less so on the conduct risks. When does the price comparison side become an advisor? That was quite a key theme across our interviews. Someone else said, if customers are unhappy with the current product or service, then the market is ripe for disruption. So again, very interesting perspective. The trend seems to be that people are asking for money for underdeveloped ideas, which seems to suggest a bubble forming. However, some of the underlying technologies have great potential, and they named blockchain and tracking devices, which is sort of Apple Watches, things like that. So another sort of interesting thought there. And then finally, the current ERM framework, current ERM framework is not unsuitable, it should say, but it's certainly not optimized. If that were ever possible, I would argue the framework is not optimized for the digital world because we are not in it yet. So, not sure what you think of that, but that's another thought we had. So, I think broadly speaking, the interview feedback tied up with what came out of the survey, and I think the messages that Richard had, and in particular the blue and red graph in terms of who is aware of various concepts and how confident they are with them, that really resonated with us. So we really thought, what would be the best way to add value to both the profession but also to general risk practitioners in this field? And we thought, rather than going down a very technical route and, defining what InsurTech is in a lot of detail and so on, let's rather come up with a guide. And this is very much a guide with a small g rather than a capital G, for risk considerations during this innovation journey. Again, taken very much from a insurance company perspective. But we thought, let's have a think about what does a typical InsurTech implementation timeline look like? And then let's see which risk considerations should be thought of at each stage of this timeline. So the rationale for this might be useful to explain just before I go into the detail. I think firms have historically tended to focus on financial, insurance, operational risks, and certainly any of those in the room who've been involved in Solvency II and delivering other types of regulatory projects are very much aware of this focus on these types of risks. I think it's fair to say that regulators have tended not to focus as much on strategic risks in the past, as you know, realistically, these are more to do with the business's performance rather than the sort of safety of policyholders. What's interesting, I think, is that, and I have a Harvard Business Review study, which I'm happy to point anyone to. What's interesting is that there have been a number of studies, including the one I'm looking at now, which show that actually strategic risks have led to the most significant losses in firms, or more significant than all other risks combined in insurance firms over the last 10 years. And one of the key strategic risks faced by many companies in this sector is digital innovation. So, as Richard mentioned earlier, our respondents to our survey and interviewees indicated a high level of awareness of new technologies and innovations, showed a lack of confidence in understanding them. We know that there is a very sort of obvious strategic angle to all of this, and we also know that actually from a company's perspective, the strategic risk is really important. So this sort of indicated to us that what would be really useful is to come up with a set of guidelines or questions that board members of companies can use when challenging, reviewing potential InsurTech targets, InsurTech investments. So really people who are not, you know, technically expert at the topic, a set of sensible questions for them that they can use at each stage of the journey. So briefly looking at what the InsurTech journey looks like for a typical investment, there's the opportunity phase, which is really considering what the options are, checking that it aligns with business strategy, and so on. Then there's the planning phase, which often ends up being a proof of concept, identifying the solution options and really that initial business case where the startup tries to convince you that this might work. Having been sufficiently convinced, it often moves into the pilot stage where slightly more serious testing of the concept, and ultimately, if that works, moves to the sort of dreaded implementation stage, where companies actually try and launch this and develop the capabilities for whatever it is that's being invested. Ultimately, assuming that implementation stage goes well, things will move into BAU, business as usual. Process becomes embedded, and then at some stage, there ought to be an effectiveness review, a lessons learned, and continuous development. So what we felt would be useful would be to try and map across that timeline a standard ERM framework that an insurance company might have. So on the left-hand side there, we have an example, example enterprise risk management framework, which many of you may be familiar with. I mean, I appreciate it's very much a non-company specific one, but certainly every company should have something around strategy and business planning, risk governance and standards, the general risk management process, risk reporting and communications. So what we thought would be very useful would be to try and see, okay, if these are my risk management framework components that I use to manage every other risk in the business, how can I apply that to a standard InsurTech implementation? And color coding seems to work. So we've effectively color coded our guide to highlight which part of the ERM framework we believe boards and senior management should be thinking about at each stage of the InsurTech journey. So, for example, certainly at the opportunity stage, relatively obvious, it should be focusing on the strategy and business planning. But perhaps during the pilot, it may not be so obvious that companies should also be thinking about strategic risk management, or how it ties in with the risk policies, or perhaps even start thinking about external communications and how they're going to explain to the market what they're doing. So what I'll do is I'll pick two examples just to give you a flavor of what we've done here. The full guideline is available as part of our report, which has been published today. And what we're really hoping is that you as practitioners can use this guideline, try and use it, let us know if it's good, if it's useful, any feedback and so on. as a way of example, I just want to zoom in on the planning stage, just on the strategy and business planning. So, for example, if you were in the planning stage and someone asked, right, have we actually thought about risk from a strategy and business planning perspective, and you haven't, we have a few high-level questions that might help you do at least a minimum amount of risk consideration for this piece. So, for example, for the business strategy and plan, do we have any previous experience of delivering digital solutions, and what lessons have been learned? What capability do we have to develop the IP in-house? Do we need to partner with external firms? Does our firm work with any accelerators, or do we need to start something on our own? On the risk strategy and objectives block, if you will, is the digital opportunity in line with our risk strategy and objectives? Has a high-level assessment been undertaken to identify the key risks arising from the opportunity? Does our firm have clear and rigorous decision-making processes to follow when choosing a digital risk opportunity? Now, I appreciate some of this might seem quite obvious in this room, in this setting, but the reality from our interviews is that a lot of this does not get considered explicitly when companies are making an investment, or when companies are having that debate on making that investment. Because remember, there are the pressures of, company X is doing it, shouldn't we also do it? There's the timelines, and there is a general lack of perhaps knowledge of the content. So being able to at least consciously ask these types of questions in the right part of the InsurTech cycle, we feel will be very helpful. I'll give you one more example. If we go to, say, the implementation stage, and have a look at the change process, training and communication. Some questions that might be useful there is our company leadership prepared to manage their functions transition to greater digitization? Again, perhaps an obvious question, but we've certainly seen examples or heard of examples in a number of companies where, while they say they might be, in practice, change comes very slowly. How can our firm empower leaders to adjust processes and technology investments to respond quickly? What challenges are there to processing new information and making decisions? So that's starting to think about, will this actually work in practice? What criteria are required to consider whether to change course if necessary? So again, this is focusing a bit more on failure and how that works. And on training, perhaps, what gaps, if any, exist in staff competencies and skills? What training needs to be developed and delivered? Are the necessary skills and expertise in-house, or is external expertise required? Again, very nice to think about all of that during that implementation stage, or perhaps even just beforehand, rather than stumbling upon it as and when you're working on the project. So, just to summarize the guideline, checklist or guidelines that we have, this is now available within our report. Very interested to hear if it works. We believe it will. We think it'll certainly facilitate decision-making and will really force the issue on a number of key questions the company should be asking up front. And ultimately, this sort of links to the ever-increasing individual responsibility on boards. We've certainly had a number of people a number of our respondents in interviews also talked about things like, do we need a cyber a non-executive? Do we need people with expertise in this? I think, to some extent, we're hoping this can bypass that argument and just give boards and senior management some structure and confidence to know that they're asking the right types of questions at each stage of the innovation journey. So that's all I wanted to say on the guidelines and the interviews. What I want to talk about briefly next is what next for the working party. So you may have noticed we kept our scope quite narrow during our first phase, and that's predominantly because it's such a broad topic. It's quite hard to produce something if you think about everything. We are hoping to widen the scope a little bit for the next phase, and there's three sort of substreams, if you will, that we're going to be looking at. The first one I've got down there is digital risk appetite. So this is really to form views and recommendations to assist actuarial practitioners and other interested parties in defining and developing a digital risk appetite of an organization. Again, focus on the insurance sector. The rationale for this is coming back to that point around failure. A number of respondents told us that some of the more successful companies they've seen have actually identified specifically a risk appetite for failure of InsurTech investments in order to make that fit into their broader risk management framework and approach. And we thought that was quite interesting because typically, certainly from all of us in the working party, risk appetite and limits are normally things you put in place so that you don't fail. So it was interesting seeing it put the other way. And so we thought we'd develop some guidelines on that, some guidance. So that's point number one. Number two, slightly more technical. So this is really the topic of blockchain. We're aware there are a number of other working parties that are, to some extent, considering this. So we thought we would really get stuck in there and leverage what others have done as well. And I guess the emphasis of this is going to be to develop emerging uses for blockchain to manage data and also for the purposes of insurance-related activities. So we'll be really looking at the pricing, customer-facing side, but also the back-office piece, which many people told us could benefit from, further consideration. And what we're also hoping to do is have perhaps some links with universities. There are a number of universities in the UK who that have PhD students and so on researching the use of this in insurance. So we're hoping to leverage some of their research in this piece. And then finally, and I suppose I feel a little bit guilty for putting it last, because in many ways this should be in the first one, is the education and training. Again, a very broad topic that we're going to try and keep reasonably narrow to start with. But clearly, the survey showed to us that there is a need for further education and training on this piece as a whole. So I think what we really want to do is identify current CPD opportunities, training opportunities, perhaps also a link in with the review of the syllabus, and I guess really identify where the knowledge of relevant concepts amongst actuaries falls short. But we want to make sure it focuses on qualified actuaries as well as potential future actuaries, perhaps acknowledging indirectly that it might actually be the qualified actuaries that are further behind on this than some future actuaries. So those are really our next planned steps. And really what I wanted to end with is just a very small comment that we are open for members for phase 2. So feel free to reach out for that. And as of today, the report and guidelines are online, so please take a look, download it, print a copy on your company pin board in the kitchen, and do let us know how that works. Hope it's useful. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Darko. Just reminds me actually when you mentioned recruiting for members of the working party on phase 2, it's something in general we're trying to, there is now a new video conferencing app, sort of a Skype type thing, so working party membership should definitely not be considered to be something you always have to travel for. So I think that would probably, in an InsurTech working party, if they can't work out how to use the video conferencing systems, I think we are in trouble. So I think we're running pretty much to time, so we've got almost half an hour for questions, in fact just a little bit more. I'm going to ask people to put up their hands if they'd like to start off. Just a reminder to, if you can stand and say your name before you begin your question. Microphone's just coming.
Okay, I don't really want to stand up particularly, but so I'm James Joyner. Thank you for the 2 talks, very interesting. Actually, for me, the most interesting slides were the last slide about what we're going to do next, because I think the education part is very important, because my second favourite slide was that one with the gaps between people know what blockchain is but have no idea what it actually means really. So yeah, definitely I think in the next phase you should be concentrating on that side, because yeah, I think that's, you know, as actuaries we need to widen the work that we do and move into these further areas, as we all know that the work in our traditional areas is declining, so it's a good idea to move into wider fields. So yeah, I definitely agree with that. I was a bit surprised though, so I've got a negative as well as a positive. The slides, I think slides 20 to 22 around the stages of an InsurTech project, well, that seems to be reinventing the wheel, because that's just any project, certainly any IT implementation, and probably any project, you could replace the InsurTech stages, those 6 stages, with IT implementation, you know, of kind of anyone. So I didn't think that really, I don't think you really invented anything new there. But yeah, absolutely, I think it's a great working party, and I think you should continue and yeah, hopefully put your 3rd bullet point first, like I think you said, Darko. I think that is the most important one, so congratulations.
Thank you for that. Very interesting point actually on that. We have had this debate whether it is just another IT project in some sense. I think probably the subtle point that I should have drawn out further is, I think often the standard IT projects tend to go straight to that implementation stage, whereas what we really need to do in this instance is a lot more careful thinking up front on whether it actually aligns strategically before launching to, you know, getting to stage 3 or 4 or whatever it was in the slide. Because it's that extra strategic emphasis, I suppose, that is what differentiates it from, you know, a new database or whatever it is.
I agree, and I suppose it does also remind people that the existing frameworks can work in this context. It gives a bit of comfort that actually it is similar to IT projects, but maybe a bit more focus up front, like say, you might need a bit more strategic thinking, a bit more testing and learning in these contexts.
Just one quick question from me. That staged sort of methodology seemed to remind me of, if you like, more traditional IT project implementation with a sort of waterfall methodology. Did you actually consider how agile working methods, does that change that framework, or does it give new challenges?
So certainly, I mean, from my perspective, we kept talking about this in our working party meetings. We kept talking about this need to stretch or flex the ERM framework around this stuff. So, you know, one example was given that it might actually be the legality or the, you know, legal policies and procedures that start causing the hiccups in a project, which, you know, it's just the identification of where you know, potential hiccups or blockages occur is quite different in these types of projects due to the speed of you know, of change and so on. So yeah, certainly agile methodology is one thing that was mentioned quite often.
Hi, I'm Sarah Jameson. So you mentioned from your interviews that the participants said the best way to go forward would be to collaborate. How do you see that working? And would an external party need to orchestrate that, like the institute and faculty?
I mean, I suppose it could happen in various ways, and I think it is happening in various ways already. So some insurers are deciding to, as we mentioned, some are deciding to buy firms outright because they don't feel like they have the expertise, or it's the quickest way to develop that expertise. Some are choosing to create their own incubators or garages, as they call them, to bring in ideas and cultivate ideas. Some are creating incubators or working with external incubators. So I think it can take different forms, I suppose, is what I'm saying, and it is already. And I think that it's hard to know which is the most successful, but I think it's interesting to see all these different approaches develop. But I think it seems to be hopefully a richer way of developing ideas and understanding them, rather than just purely working as an insurer developing its own thoughts and new technologies.
Thanks. I'm David Robinson. Very grateful to the authors and the working party for what I thought was a very interesting paper, very practical and topical paper. So I'd like to comment on one aspect of InsurTech that I think deserves more weight. You started to touch on it right at the end, really, and that's organisational culture. So section 7.10 and then the matrix you just showed, the ERM matrix, sets out a useful checklist of risks to be reviewed if an insurer sets out to do something that might be classified as InsurTech. Your conduct risk, data risk, financial risk, cyber risk, and so on. These are all good left brain risks. There's not much right brain risk there. If we think of risk not just in terms of stopping bad things happening, but making sure that good things happen, that strategy and plans are delivered, then organisational culture becomes very important. So with any change, there are vested interests. People who may feel threatened by the change that's happening or disadvantaged by the change. And you talk, I think, at one point in the paper about dealing with the casualties. It's not just about dealing with the casualties from change, it's about making sure that the whole team is on board. I think if you've not got a strong chief executive, and I've seen this happen, I have to say, I've dealt with a few InsurTech startups over the last dozen years or so, and I've seen a few instances where a really good idea has fallen at the last hurdle because the chief executive was weak, and so the sales director or the IT director objected to whatever change was being introduced, and it fell apart at the last minute. I'm not saying Brexit's a good idea, but maybe this is a similar situation that you have just now, because I'm completely against it. You've talked just now about collaboration. I think that's a really useful way of fast-tracking changes to elements of value chains. And I'd say to any organisation that 99.99 and lots of 9% of the best brains in the world live outside your organisation. So if there are organisations out there that are optimising parts of the value chain, why would you not talk to them? I think a question and a suggested extra piece of work for the team is to do some research amongst startup InsurTechs themselves. I think the experience that they have would be very interesting. As I say, I've come across one or two organisations which have got right to the end of the journey, and then right at the last minute, they've put a lot of effort into it, it's fallen apart. The other thing I'd say to insurers is please play fair, because they have lots of capital. InsurTechs tend to be weakly funded, and it's not fair really to pinch their IP, because the insurers have the capital to defend any actions. The startups haven't got the capital to deploy for that, typically. So insurers must play fair. And I think advice to startup InsurTechs, optimising bits of the value chain, is make sure you're dealing with the right people in the organisation. Make sure you're dealing with people who can make the decision, who can influence the decision maker. Because it's very easy to spend a lot of time developing a concept, working with a potential insurer, and then you find that the people you're dealing with haven't got the power to make the decision, and it falls apart at the last minute. So I thought it was a really excellent paper, and so thanks very much.
Thank you. I think that's something that we wanted to try and do is to get more perspective from outside the profession. We were hoping to get more people respond to our survey, but unfortunately we didn't get more than 10%. But I think you're right. I think that will be a very welcome contribution. And anecdotally, when we have talked to startup community, you're right. A lot of the things that stand out are they're not knowing who is the right person to talk to, and spend a lot of time and energy. And also educating insurers is another challenge. They spend a lot of time educating. It's like, why don't they know this already? Why are we having to give all our free time and energy to tell you, how this works and why it's important to you? So I think there's a lot of frustration there from that kind of that perspective. So the more that insurers can do to make it easy for startups, maybe have a separate dedicated team. These garages or incubators are a way to do that. Particularly if they've got allocated budget as well and kind of clear processes, that makes it a lot easier and should make it a much more fruitful, I suppose, collaboration as well. So, thank you very much.
My name is Brian Moretta. Listening to the comment before last and the response and towards the end of the story, I couldn't help but think of, there's a well-known book called The Innovator's Dilemma. And a lot of these issues that, and some that David also raised, are discussed in that book, where essentially there's the issues about established companies handling new entrants or new technologies and how they deal with that. And his book initially focused on disk drives and how every generation of disk drive maker completely failed to pick up the next generation of disks, almost without exception. And he has two recommendations within that. One is, don't speak to your customers, or don't necessarily rely on your customers, because they don't know what they want until they actually get it. And that's sort of, I sometimes describe it as the Steve Jobs phenomenon. And that creates a lot of issues, because you have an existing customer base that you really, really do want to listen to and service. And within that creates a dilemma in an organization where if you have an InsurTech startup, say, within an organization, that could be starved of funding because actually it's dealing with a small number of people compared to the existing customer base. It doesn't necessarily seem that relevant. It might, in a lot of cases with disk drives, they actually started by growing a new customer base and then cannibalizing the existing market. And I think that's what we're going to see a lot of in InsurTech as well. So having an external company, so there's two suggestions that he suggested: either have external companies and you sort of link with them or partner them, or when you create a company, you segregate it internally from the existing organization. And that means, he recommends actually separate locations, separate budgets. So you create an organization where actually gaining 20 customers is significant for them. And that can create a different culture, whereas if you're in a company that already has 1 million customers, adding 20 or 30 or even 100 customers isn't going to make any difference. So you can have that culture where it's celebrated. I think from a risk management perspective, this creates some really big issues in insurance in particular. I think we're all aware of Mark Zuckerberg's sort of mandate about move fast and break things. Some things in insurance we can break very easily. Some things, if we break them, they have very strong consequences. And I think from a risk management perspective, we have to be clear about which is which. And I think that's something that needs to be brought out within any framework. I think the other thing that also occurred to me as I was listening to this was the insurance industry has been through some of these changes before. And in some sense, I'm not surprised that general insurance is adopting these things faster than life insurance, because general insurance actually went through this 20 years ago, 30 years ago, with the adoption of telephones and direct line. And we all know what happened. Direct line came in, it became a significant new competitor. Life insurance hasn't seen that same disruption in its history, or at least in living history. I think the last major innovation was probably the introduction of unit linked, and I don't remember that. I think it'd be interesting to sort of see if anything disruptive came along. And one question, I sort of at the risk of wrapping up as a question rather than a long ramble, do you see if the idea of anything disruptive changing the risk management framework out there, and that, you know, something that could be, I mean, not necessarily looking at anything specific that we know what it is, but if there's a step change for the industry, how does that change the sort of risk management sort of things that we're talking about here?
Thank you for that. observation and question. I fully agree with your observations as well. I guess what I can say is, you know, it kind of links to the cultural bit as well. So one example I have in mind that I actually heard at a conference I went to was, I don't know if anyone's heard of an insurance company called Lemonade. So they're based in the States, and they've kind of, long story short, their approach has been to be an online-only, digital-only insurance company that eliminates dealing with people. And I was reading their year-end report. It's very interesting reading, because in the section written by the chief risk officer, there's a paragraph that says, you know, we're so efficient and you know, so disruptive and efficient that one of our claims, the first time this is the chief risk officer saying, first time he found out about that claim was after the money had been paid. Okay, now, you know, for someone who works in a risk function, for me, that would keep me up at night. You know, that is the sort of an absolute no-no, effectively, is to find out that only after the fact that you've actually paid physical money to someone for a claim. So I think, you know, maybe that gives you a little bit of flavor in terms of what is possible in theory versus how things work at the moment. And I know, you know, certainly if I'm the chief risk officer of that particular company, I would not like that, right? In fact, I'd like to know, you know, regardless of the enabling technology that's in place to do that. Now, the question, I suppose, then is a much higher level question in terms of, would you one day be comfortable with that being the case? Because, you know, if you would be, and if the regulator would be, and then if the customers would be, certainly they probably would quite like that. You know, so the question is then, when do we get to that state? When does that become normal? When is that the new normal? And, you know, maybe that's a discussion for the pub, because I certainly wouldn't be that comfortable with that kind of approach. But others may differ.
Good evening. My name is Harry Taylor, and I'm an independent consultant. I've got a particular interest in innovation. I've got one question to ask about what the Working Party has done, something about what you're going to do next, and a suggestion for a quick win. So to quickly go through this, but to begin by saying I think it's an excellent paper. I think it's very timely, and I think anyone that doesn't read it and doesn't think about it is really going to be missing a trick over the next 5 to 10 years. So first of all, about what you've done, I had a question, and it's around growth and the use of InsurTech as a driver of growth in businesses. And I just wondered what kind of customers from your research you were finding that FinTech or InsurTech had a particular resonance with. Is it just across the whole customer base, or are there particular segments that are growing the market? And is the driver increased customer engagement, or is it increased value for money because it enables a lower cost base to be delivered? My belief is that InsurTech is not just about millennials and not just about the next group of people coming along. I think it's a whole cultural trend and a cultural change. And also aligned to that, the sub-question is, do you think the biggest platform that currently exists and is being funded and growing free for delivering InsurTech is being properly exploited? And that's the smartphone. And this is a global phenomenon. Okay? So that's about what you've done. The next one was a question. I was intrigued about things you might be doing next, and one of the things is definition of digital risk appetite. So I just wonder what you mean by that, and how would a business articulate its risk appetite for InsurTech? For example, and this is just off the top of my head, it might be that they have normal financial requirements for time to break even for something, the amount of capital they're prepared to invest in something, and also their loss capacity. And by loss, I mean not just financial terms, but I mean the willingness to take on regulatory fines if it goes horribly wrong, the willingness to accept serious brand damage if it goes horribly wrong. So that was just a few metrics. I just wondered whether in that bit there about definition of digital risk appetite, you were thinking along those lines, or is there something else? And finally, quick win. And I tie this into one of the findings, that is that lots of people know the words but wouldn't feel comfortable explaining it. One of the things, I do a lot of research for different people, and one of the things I find when I'm doing the research is that you very quickly find lots of trusted sources. You find, when you Google something and you get 5 million responses, there will be 3 of them that are really useful and worthwhile reading, and you very quickly home in on those. That's one of the most powerful things that you can share with other people in the profession. So my suggestion for a quick win would be don't even bother constructing cheat sheets, as you suggest in A1.7, which I think is a good suggestion. Even faster, just publish as an addendum to it a set of useful links. So, question about growth, question about definitions, and a suggestion on a quick win. But I think it's a fantastic paper, great, and everyone should be reading it, especially older actuaries.
Okay. Thank you very much. Taking sort of the growth one, I suppose, I think there is the natural tendency for some of the solutions to appeal more to younger customers. I think millennials are more open, we know, to sharing data, provided there's something that's given back to them in insurance context. But I do think there is an awful lot of potential for older customers, vulnerable customers. Some of the new technologies are quite interesting, at-home monitors to detect people having or risk of having falls and therefore preventing them going into hospital. And so the whole kind of need to think about care and how technology can be used there is quite an exciting area, particularly as we might see hopefully a more clarity around how we deal with care and how insurance fits into that space. So I think there's definitely opportunity at all kind of sectors of the kind of customer or potential customer bases profile in society. I think it isn't just about engagement of value. I think it is also about helping to better understand the customer and therefore help to think about prevention as well as claim as well. I think that's really important long term for our industry. We can't just be focused on claims. We need to be thinking about those early warning signs. Like Darko was saying, we're in a world where insurance companies are already having automated claims before they realise. So we need to know sooner rather than later, what are the early warning signs we need to be aware of. That there's probably data already emerging, we just don't know how to capture it or analyse it yet, possibly. So I think there's a lot more to think about in how we can develop more prevention sort of strategies. And finally, your other question on in that space was around, are we fully utilising smartphones? No, I think is my opinion. I think they've come a long way, and I'm sure they've got a long way to go as well. So I think as they become more reliable and they add even more kind of data, it's going to be a very rich data set that we can look at and utilise.
Thanks, Richard. I guess on the digital risk appetite question, the short answer is yes. It's exactly the kind of metrics that you're thinking of. The bit I want to emphasize, though, is that it's not just focusing on the downside, it's also focusing on the upside, because I think what a number of companies might find themselves, were they to have a fully developed digital risk appetite, is that they're not actually pushing hard enough on some of these aspects. So, it may be the case that actually you do have some loss capacity, and you may want to take on a bit of reputational risk if it means having, this app or this kind of system or what have you. So it's both, the intention is both, to help develop ultimately risk tolerances and risk limits, and then be able to, in true actuarial sense, look at actual versus expected and make some business decisions.
Good evening. My name's John Gill. Can I add my thanks to the authors of the thought-provoking paper? I have a concern about operational resilience and whether there's enough focus on that. by way of a very timely example, I came here by bus this evening, and people who live in Edinburgh use a wonderful app that allows you to load up bus tickets in advance and display them to the bus driver. And then you never have to run around and get change, which is fantastic, except, as in tonight, sometimes it just doesn't connect. And therefore, Lothian Transport, in their wisdom, say as a contingency, please take some change with you. So clearly they have an operational resilience problem. In InsurTech, and indeed banking as well, a lot of what's being developed at the moment is very much around decisioning technology, whether that's new business underwriting or whether that's in claims management. Failure to have appropriate operational resilience means almost certainly no new business or no claims payment, or perhaps even worse, rather than no decision, an incorrect or incomplete decision being made because one part of the system was not resilient. So whilst I very much welcomed your paper, I would have liked to have seen more on operational resilience. Judging by the discussion paper that the Bank of England, PRA and FCA put out in July, they'd like to see lots more about operational resilience across the industry. And I just ask, is that something you've considered? And because it would be gratefully received by all.
I'm not sure if we've talked something we've considered already, but I guess I think it's a very good point. So I think when I think about some of the usage of technology, we're seeing insurers use it to engage more with customers, and it creates so many more touch points in a life insurance context. And life insurers aren't generally used to having that many engagement points, other than at the point of just applying and going on risk and then claim. When you're creating like whole programs, for example, around wellness, where you've got potentially daily or weekly touch points, that creates so many more complexities. And I think that is a challenge for insurers who don't have necessarily the mindset to be able to think about how you're continuing to maintain that kind of customer experience and journey. So I think it is a very big area. I agree with you, and I think perhaps it should be another area that we consider as a next step. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. My name is Lloyd Van Furen. I'm actually on the Cashless Society Working Group, so I'm quite interested in what you guys are talking about. There's quite a bit of crossover because we're thinking about all the digital currencies and then that sort of thing. One of the areas that we focused on was, I guess, regional variation. So I had a particular interest in Africa, and some of the technology there, it's sort of leapfrogging. So, for example, the West, I guess, went from talking to one another, telegrams, landlines, and then smartphones. Africa sort of missed out the landline bit and then went straight to smartphone. So you may be interested in looking at Africa and Asia, places that in 50 years will be way ahead of here, and really getting to the cutting edge of where all the change is happening. So just, thanks for that. It's been really useful for me. Thanks a lot.
I think one of the questions that struck me was the two risks that you didn't mention. And one is the sort of, in a sense, I was less worried about insurance companies not having resilient processes, because that's sort of what we do. More the worry is that we're so worried about the downside that we don't actually get on and do something. And the risks of actually not doing something may lead to obsolescence of the business model. I don't know if you came across that in your...
Yeah, so I think certainly, I'll speak from the interview perspective. That was definitely something that was touched on, and the fear of missing out. I think a lot of companies, the perception was that a lot of companies had that. I think the nervousness, I suppose, of the executives was mainly around just going for what they called a Me Too business model, where my competitor's doing it, so I need to do it as well, without actually thinking about you know, how does that fit with our wider strategy? But certainly, I was under the impression that some companies were already doing stress and scenario testing around around doing nothing, and having that as a stress to their business model.
I think we have time for one final question. Do we have any? No burning questions? I think maybe I'll ask just one final one about, I mean, I think what you indicated is that insurance companies perhaps are behind. I mean, you indicated you thought they were behind banks, but I think banks are probably also behind other industries. And perhaps actuaries are behind other new professions in this. You mentioned education, but do you think that that's something that should be taken forward in a more concrete way?
Yeah, I think so. I think it feels like we need to, we're never going to be at the forefront of new technologies, I don't think, and I don't think that needs to be our purpose, but I think we need to have a good understanding and keep up with them so we know how they can impact our industry, our businesses, and our customers. So, but it's a difficult one, I think, isn't it? Because there's so much happening all the time. Some structure, I think, to help us filter through that the more important changes and developments will be important, I think, and maybe setting our objectives, our CPD objectives as they are, kind of, you know, maybe we need to be carving out some of those to be on new technologies to make sure we're all kind of keeping ahead as much as we can. That's my thoughts.
I mean, from my perspective, it comes down to a cultural point, because if you look at other industries, if you look at a year-end report of a oil company or a pharmaceutical company, you know, they're very proud of the millions and millions that they've spent in R&D, you know, and I think that's really, really, really hidden in an insurance company's, you know, that big expense that was committed to during the course of the year. So I think let's just sort of starting with that mindset. I think there's probably quite a long way to go in the insurance sector to really start seeing that as a positive. And I understand, you know, all the pressures and whatnot, but I think it's fair to say that other industries have them as well. So it's maybe an interesting perspective to think about other industries.
Okay, yeah, I think it's certainly something from we had a strategy discussion in IFOA Council last week, and certainly developing the education system to incorporate and so that we don't get left behind in areas such as data analytics, artificial intelligence is certainly on the top of our minds. So I think we're always open to, if anyone has good ideas of how we can take that forward, then very much welcome. I think we seem to have come to the end of the questions. So perhaps I'd like to thank the presenters for the talk this evening.